Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is. I'm Peter Whittle. Now I'm delighted that my guest this week has been on the channel before when he wrote an enormously successful book on Winston Churchill. Andrew Roberts has just written a new biography of George III, but of course he's the author of something like 18 books, including biographies of Lord Salisbury, Lord Halifax and Napoleon. The new book is called George III, The Life and Reign of Britain's Most Misunderstood Monarch. Thank you very much for coming, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Peter. It's great to be on the show again.
Yes. Most misunderstood monarch. Now, the way that most people have seen this, I would say, in this country at least, is in the sense of, was he mad, or what, did he have some terrible illness or whatever? But this is wider than that, isn't it?
Much wider, yes. I think the three things that people know about George III was that he had porphyria, this form of madness, that his obstinacy lost us the American colonies, and obviously from the Declaration of Independence and from Hamilton the musical, he's thought of also as a tyrant. And all three of those things are completely wrong. It wasn't porphyria that he had, it was manic depression and bipolar disorder, which most doctors now accept. So that theory, which has been around for 50 years, and which Alan Bennett and Nicholas Heitner and others, made TV shows and plays about, completely wrong. He most certainly was not a obstinate idiot who lost the American colonies. In fact, he was a constitutional monarch, and it was the politicians and later the generals and admirals that lost that war. And he certainly was not a tyrant either. America, in fact, was one of the most free countries in the world in the 1760s. And we know what 18th century tyranny was like from the Russians and Austrians and Prussians and so on. And the way he treated America was completely different from that.
So basically, we've got him wrong, but America has him wrong. You mentioned Hamilton the music there. This idea of tyranny and of George being a tyrant, that is very much the American view, isn't it?
It's Holy Writ in America, and understandably so. Every nation needs to have its creation myths, but it is a myth. The king was guilty of imposing taxation. It was only ever very small amounts of taxation, by the way, and it was all the money that was raised was going to be spent in America on Americans. But nonetheless, he did have the right to tax, the constitutional right, in the same way that his 9 predecessors since Elizabeth I did. And he also, of course, had veto powers over American legislation. So that justifies, in my view, the revolution. They had the right, they had the ability, they had the numbers, they had the economy to set up their own state in the 1770s. But that doesn't justify the propaganda, sheer wartime propaganda, of making him out to be a tyrant. He wasn't. In the 28 charges that Thomas Jefferson accuses him of in the Declaration of Independence, only 2 of them are true.
Apparently around this time we've had a lot of statues being torn down, haven't we? But his was torn down in New York, wasn't it?
Yes, it was during the Revolution. In fact, only a few days after the Declaration of Independence. So the Declaration came out on the 4th of July, 1776, and his statue was pulled down in Manhattan on the 9th of July. There were large numbers of statues that were being attacked. His coat of arms was pulled down. They changed the names of places that had his name in it. So it was a sort of general free-for-all, really, as in the way that you get in revolutions.
Would you go as far as to say that he was a great monarch? I mean, you're obviously, looking at him in a different light now, but
I don't think he was a great monarch. No, I think he was a great man. But because he was a constitutional monarch, and he only on one occasion ever actually sacked a government that had a majority in the House of Commons and appointed another, and he was justified in doing that in the subsequent general election in which the incoming government won a landslide victory. But he was a fine man. He was a really upstanding, splendid man in so many ways. He was the man who created the Royal Academy, who created the nucleus for the British Library with his library of 80,000 books. He bought Buckingham Palace and had a proper loving relationship with his wife, the only one of the Hanoverian monarchs actually to be faithful to his wife. He was a good-natured man, as we see from the diaries of Fanny Burney, and he was somebody who showed tremendous sort of dignity and a sense of duty, in the sense, actually, I believe, that he's the founder of the modern monarchy, much more than Queen Victoria. We'll probably come on to that later, but so in that sense, I think when we look at our present Queen, we see a monarch who has inherited many of George III's best attributes.
Yes, I mean, as you say, we're going to talk about it a bit later, but without wishing to be too frivolous, you have the situation of George being a very domestic man, didn't travel very much, did he?
No, he never went, extraordinarily, he never went north of Worcester or west of Plymouth. He was king of Scotland and Ireland and never went there. He certainly didn't go to America, of course, and he was Elector of Hanover and never went there either. He stayed in the home counties.
But, we have an extremely sort of worthy monarch now, and obviously George III had a very difficult relationship with his son George IV, who was more extravagant, shall we say.
Oh my God, he was absolutely, totally, he had compulsive buying disorder. He was the sort of Imelda Marcos of the 18th century. He couldn't see something without buying it. There was one point where he was spending as much money, and it's essentially taxpayers' money, because he got bailed out all the time by Parliament, the same amount as we were spending on the Royal Navy.
Yes, but do you think that, Prince Charles has a kind of reputation for being rather extravagant, doesn't he? And whereas the Queen's very thrifty, but it's not in the same league, is it?
Nothing like the same league. No, but George III was frugal as well, and he ate and drank very abstemiously, like the Queen does. So I suppose there's the outlines of an analogy there, but really not at all, because Prince Charles doesn't rack up massive debts that require the whole of the sort of British economy to be rocking in dealing with.
If you look back at this extraordinary period, not just the American War of Independence, but of course we had as you say in the book, the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, because he was, up until that point, the longest reigning, wasn't he, Mark?
He still is the longest reigning king.
Longest reigning king. When you said there he's a constitutional monarch, how did that work then, Andrew? Because it's not really when we look at the monarch today, it seems very, very clear cut. But you then mentioned there that he didn't sack a government. What was the role of the constitutional monarch in his time?
It was much more powerful, obviously, than the one today, but he didn't veto any bills, for example, which he had the constitutional right to do. He only on one occasion appointed a Prime Minister who didn't have the support of the House of Commons, and that was because the radical Whigs were trying to nationalise the East India Company and would have therefore accreted to themselves such huge powers that he thought that was going to alter the powers in the Constitution. He was able to, and did, and was one of the last prime ministers to, the last monarch to appoint cabinet ministers separately from the prime minister and deal with them on a one-to-one basis. And after him, everybody dealt with governments through the prime minister. So that gave him a good deal of power. But it's less power than the American president has today, for example.
Right. So if that were the case with George, when would you roughly say that the monarchy as it stands today in political terms, would that have been Victoria that really formed?
Yes, that's George III's granddaughter, Queen Victoria, who very much was able, as you see in the bedchamber crisis of 1843, was able to sack a government. was it 1839? She did it twice, in fact, but she wasn't able to do that by the end of her time. You know, elections by that stage were very obviously did show the will of the people, and monarchs weren't able to just ignore that.
I think one of the attitudes you have here towards the Hanoverian monarchs, really, one of the aspects of it is they're seen as being kind of alien, or they didn't speak, you know, English as a first language. George III was intensely patriotic, wasn't he? I mean, there's this phrase, born and educated in this country, I glory in the name of Britain.
Exactly. He was the first British Hanoverian monarch. The first one didn't even speak English, but George spoke English without a German accent. He spoke German as well, but he spoke English as his first language. And as you say, he was a patriot. He thought of himself primarily as British. And indeed, he was quite anti-Hanoverian in the early part of his life. When he was Prince of Wales, he called it that horrid electorate. It was only much later, when he was king and it was threatened by Napoleon, that he became a lot closer to it. Right. Although not physically, as I mentioned, you know, he never went there.
Isn't it right that you had access to quite a bit of new material with this book from the Royal Archives?
Yes, the Queen in 2015 put 100,000 pages of George III documents, letters mainly, but lots of other kind of documents, onto something called the Georgian Papers programme, a wonderful programme at King's College London. And so we have this vast new sort of avalanche of material, which was fascinating to go through, because there's only been one other biography of George III in the last half century.
Really? And what emerged from this material for you?
Well, one of the really interesting things that emerged from it was that as Prince of Wales, when he was writing an essay as a young man in the 1750s, he actually very much opposed slavery. And he says in this essay that all the arguments for slavery are ludicrous and ridiculous, and that it has to be held up to execration. And that's why, I think, he never bought or sold a slave in his life. He didn't invest in the companies that owned slaves. He, of course, signed the legislation that abolished the slave trade. But he was not an abolitionist himself. And you have to... This is a difficult issue, really, because, of course, we all know how evil, what a monstrous thing slavery was. And partly this was because he was a constitutional monarch, and there was no majority for the abolition of slavery during his lifetime in the House of Commons or the House of Lords. And also, he recognised that about a third of the revenues that came from the West Indies, which was a huge amount of British government income, really did come from stuff like sugar, which they couldn't work out a way of farming without slavery.
I see. So it was very much the contemporary pragmatic mindset, if you like.
It was realpolitik. But also, the positive side of it is that he didn't want to, even if he had wanted to abolish slavery, he probably wouldn't have, because, as I say, he was somebody who did not want to go against the will of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. It wasn't until 1829 that they got rid of slavery, and he'd been dead by 9 years by then.
Can you just tell us just some of the sort of treatments he would have been subjected to when he was...
So terrible, poor man. I mean, it's really the pathos of it is overwhelming. Sometimes he was put in what was called straight waistcoat, what we call a straight jacket, for hours and hours on end. He was physically held down in a chair that he nicknamed his throne. He was gagged when he talked too much. On some occasions when he had these attacks, he would talk for 24 hours without stopping. He was given the most incredibly painful bleeding so-called cures, which were not cures at all. They just made it work. The whole process worse, where they would put it's something called cupping, where they would put a glass on his thigh and his arms to sort of bring up and heat it. It would then be heated, and it would sort of lacerate his skin. He was incredibly brave. He was a brave man anyway. He survived 6 assassination attempts, and he was immensely brave in the Gordon riots and in the invasion threats and so on. But never more brave, I think, than when he was the helpless spectator at his own mental collapse.
And he did actually, in the end, go what we might call insane, didn't he?
Oh yes, no, he was absolutely. This it was a bipolar disorder that for the last 10 years of his life he had 5 attacks of it. Most historians say there were only 4, but I've discovered a prodrome attack in 1765 that I'm certain was this, and the last whole 10 years of his life, he was mad, and he was also, poor man, senile and blind and deaf. And when his blindness came on, you wanted examples of horrible things that happened. Well, when his blindness came on, with his first set of oncome of blindness, they put leeches on his eyes.
Oh. It's just
terrible.
Unspeakable, isn't it?
Unspeakable.
He was also known as Farmer George, wasn't he? And there are some examples in the book of really very touching encounters with the public, long before we had things like the walkabout and everything. I mean, he would actually, I suppose the king could walk about then, but without necessarily being recognised.
Well, I mean, other than the currency, there was, people didn't know what he looked like much. There were some prints, of course, but you wouldn't spot him sort of coming down the road and think that's the king, especially as he very often went around without any entourage at all, and he dressed as a normal gentleman farmer. Or at least a gentleman. He wasn't like Louis XVI, who sort of completely overdressed all the time. And so he would just wander around the countryside sometimes and bumping into ordinary people. He'd talk about the price of hay, and there are lots of occasions where the person then later is surprised to discover that she's been talking to the king. These stories abound. Usually at the end he gives her a guinea. He
seemed therefore to be popular as you say, for long stretches, but there were a few attacks, as you say, I think on his way, particularly onto the state opening of Parliament.
Yes, he wasn't always popular at all. Especially in the early part of his reign, he appointed a Scot, the Earl of Bute, to be Prime Minister at a time that the Scots were tremendously unpopular still in London, because the Jacobite rebellion had only ended in 1745, and that made him profoundly unpopular. His mother was very unpopular as well, completely unfairly. That people thought that Princess Augusta had been sleeping with the Earl of Bute, this Prime Minister, and which she wasn't, but nonetheless that brought unpopularity. So during the Wilkesite riots, supporters of the journalist John Wilkes threw stones at his carriage as he went, as you said, to the state opening of Parliament, and on occasion it got pretty nasty. They were full-scale riots.
I mean, this goes perhaps for all your subjects, really. I mean, have you ended up liking, say, like George or Halifax or Salisbury, ended up liking or admiring them more than when you started out?
Some I have, others not. Lord Mountbatten I wrote about in my book Eminent Churchillians, who I was expecting to like much more, and actually I found him just too much of a showman, and too obsessed with his own reputation, and too willing to manipulate the evidence with regard to his own reputation. So I'm afraid he didn't really grow on me. There have been a few others also, but with Winston Churchill and Napoleon, I think it's probably the sense of humour. They were just very funny people. They were constantly coming out with jokes that are still funny in Napoleon's case 200 years later.
Yes, it shows a sort of humanity, I suppose, doesn't it?
That and a slight ability to take the mickey out of oneself, which one doesn't automatically assume is there in a conqueror or an emperor. One thing
that's quite interesting, really, is that during George's reign, it was a kind of revolutionary time. There was the French Revolution, Napoleonic Wars, and then that, obviously, after he died, it became more so in Europe. Did he have a sense of the institution being fragile?
The institution of monarchy?
Yes.
Very much, especially after the execution of Louis XVI. He had a sort of love-hate relationship with Louis XVI because, of course, it was Louis XVI's declaration of war against Britain in 1778 that had effectively turned the American Revolution into a world war and meant that it was going to be very, very difficult for us to win. So France being the rival power, he didn't mind seeing a revolution there, but one that started to chop off royals' heads, of course, suddenly becomes an awful lot more serious ideologically, and that's why he, after a lifetime of being opposed by Edmund Burke, for example, once Burke wrote his reflections on the revolution in France, George embraced him. So that is a moment, a very worrying moment, not just for George, of course, but also for the Austrian, Prussian, Russian monarchies.
Do you think the monarchy now is more fragile than it would have been then? I mean, when we see that he went through periods of unpopularity, for example, there's very, very vivid demonstrations, people actually throwing things at his carriage. That would never, or doesn't really happen now.
No.
But do you think the institution, if the foundations were basically laid during his reign, do you think it's in rude health, or?
I think it is with Her Majesty the Queen, absolutely. I mean, apart from, of course, she's in her mid-90s. But I think that whenever you look at the polls, the number of people who want a republic in Britain, I mean, it's pretty much the same as people who want to have everyone speak Esperanto. It's a really sort of fringe interest, really, republicanism in this country.
Yes. It's interesting you mentioned there, when you look at the polls, the Republican percentage hasn't pretty much changed for about 40 or 50 years. This is despite the ups and downs. But it does seem sometimes that the rest of the establishment, perhaps in a way that wouldn't have been the case in George's day, are pretty much pitted against it in a way.
Well, I think that some of the newspapers can go very far in denigrating the monarchy, but they certainly did in George III's time as well. And when one thinks of those cartoons of Gilray and Rowlandson and so on, Cruikshank, they were incredibly vicious, much more vicious actually, I think, than you get away with today. So I think for the monarchy to be in danger, you would have to have one of the great political parties embrace republicanism and actually, want to argue in the House of Commons and the House of Lords that this system be changed for a different one, and not even the. Actually, I don't know what the stance of the Greens is on the monarchy. They probably are Republican, aren't they? But other than that, I don't think it's been embraced by any sort of mainstream party. You
don't think that there would be a possibility that, you see, there's absolutely nothing to be gained, is there, by attacking the Queen, because she's universally respected. But once she's no longer there, one can see sort of situation arising where people start asking for referendums, things like that. I think,
and also, of course, there are going to be some Commonwealth countries probably that leave the Commonwealth after, or at least they don't leave the Commonwealth. They will no longer have the British head of state as their head of state. and that's a process that's already starting. But frankly, I think the British people are so much more intelligent than they're given credit for by some people, because they can tell the difference between having a person who's unpopular as king or queen and actually getting rid of an entire system that's been around for 1,000 years, provides a bulwark against dictatorship and overmighty politicians, and which has worked, extremely well, and it's a very cheap form of having a power above politics. So I think that even if you had, say, Prince William became unpopular, it doesn't mean that they would, the British people would get rid of the entire monarchy. I think they just wait until Prince George.
I think what's particularly interesting in the context of our times this past year, what we talked about when you were last on the channel, which was the statue toppling that went on. The monarchy, in a way, is the absolute living embodiment of what is disliked by these people. It is the symbol of our history. It's a symbol of our imperial history. And I just wonder whether...
much more than that. Also, the apex of a class system, the fount of honour, the centre of philanthropy, lots of things that people who want to overturn society hate.
What I've found is that people who were natural Republicans, some of them have been on this show, are sort of finding themselves sort of lining up with the monarchy, because now so much is at stake, it seems. I mean, I wanted to ask you a little about this, Andrew. I mean, when you started out as an historian, I'm sure you wouldn't have seen yourself as being on the absolute front line of an attack generally on our past. I mean, in some ways, you are there on the front line as an historian, aren't you?
Well, I don't know that I am, but Churchill is, of course. He's on the front line of the culture wars, and I am the most recent biographer of Churchill. So in a sense, I'm sort of, I'm pushed there. And I'm perfectly happy to be there, by the way. I think the culture wars are genuine. It's a genuine struggle, not brought on by conservative-minded people at all, but by ultra-progressive people who want to use them as a way of destabilising our society, our sense of identity, our sense of where we came from, and so on. So I think that if you are, and by the way, I think they'll ultimately lose the culture wars as well, because the more that people recognise that this is a struggle, the more ordinary, normal, sensible people come to the side of the argument that says, no, we shouldn't be pulling down statues, we should perhaps be putting statues in their proper context, we should be putting up more statues. But if any local community is asked whether or not Buller in Exeter or Robert Baden-Powell or Francis Drake are going to be pulled down in their market squares, I think you're going to get a huge majority against it. And so I'm up for these local referenda. I think the more the merrier.
Yes, great when they happen. But I think the comments we get from viewers is they're perplexed that even though there's such strength of feeling popularly, somehow the steamroller seems to carry on.
Well, exactly. Yeah, it's left up to the trustees of Guy's Hospital to box up Thomas Guy, and not up to the people around, who ought to have a vote on it. I think when local people are given a vote on these things, they'll give a resounding raspberry to the people who, for entirely politically correct and woke reasons, want to try to see the past entirely in terms of the present, which is as moronic as trying to see the present in terms of the future. And you just can't do it. You can't. I mean, we don't know what Oliver Cromwell would think about socialised medicine. It's just impossible to time travel like that. But that's essentially what these woke people are trying to make us do.
I mean, do you subscribe to the view of there having been a long march through our institutions, because the reason I ask is that, you know, you have described, for example, when you have spoken at various, I think there was a panel on Churchill that you spoke at, and it seems to me the case that the people that you are with who are, you know, attacking Churchill, they're doing it because he's an emblem particularly of our spirit. You know, that's how he's seen, for better or worse. And they are in these institutions, they are in incredibly influential universities.
Well, on this occasion, actually, the institution was Churchill College, Cambridge,
Right.
Where four academics, I wasn't on that panel, four academics were sort of basically egging each other on. They all agreed with one another that Winston Churchill was, as one of them put it, as bad as Hitler. This was last February. And yes, there has been a long march through the institutions really since the 1960s, and not just the academic institutions, but you see it really across society. I was hoping that a Tory government would, certainly one that's been in power for 10 years, would have turned this back in some way. I haven't seen that yet. I know that some people are involved in that and tried hard. I think Oliver Dowden did a good job as Secretary of State for Culture. I've got high hopes for anybody else who, you know, takes up those cudgels. But it does seem that although the British people are still willing to vote Tory, there are fewer and fewer actual conservative-minded people at key places in British culture and society, and it's and it doesn't seem to be affected by who's in power.
But can they, for example, can a government not make sure that when appointments are made to quangos, for example, or these sort of things, that they are made by people who are more sympathetic to their view, the government's view?
That is happening, but it's happening late, and it's not happening aggressively. And also, you know, there is an element that Tony Blair did this. He understood the power of the quangocracy, and I just think that conservative-minded people are a bit, you know, late to the game, frankly. Yeah. But it doesn't mean that I've still got high hopes that you know, this is not a completely lost battle. So
yes, I mean, you said earlier we, as it were, an inverse, would win this. I mean, I think that people need to be encouraged so much, because you know, when you walk away from the kind of discussions we have, and ordinary people, you know, living their lives, you know, and see every day a little bit more being chipped away, and this is utterly demoralising, which I think surely is one of the purposes of it.
Absolutely. Yes, no, I agree. I think that the literal sense of demoralisation of a nation is something that certainly the extreme left would love to achieve in this country. But no, the reason that I said that I think that we're winning is only if A, people know that there's a battle going on, which I think they do now, and B, their voice is heard. Especially at the ballot box, which is why, as I mentioned, I think that before any statue is taken down anywhere, there should be a vote of local people about it.
You're involved with a new campaign called History Reclaimed, which I think is started by Robert Toombs.
Yes,
right?
Yeah. Well, Robert, you know, he's very much the driving force, as is David Abulafia, the professor at Cambridge. But also, I think they have 40 or 50 people, including me, on their sort of advisory board. So it's not just beleaguered Robert. There are lots of us.
And this basically is. Is it a website, or is it something people can become involved?
It's a website, absolutely. It's got ambitions to be much more than that. It's got a lot of hits, actually. Quite astoundingly large number of people, visit it and donate to us and so on. And what it's going to do is really be a quick response unit. Rapid response unit, they're called, aren't they? When something, you know, ridiculous and woke and untrue is said about history, about some historical figure or some historical fact, it's going to come out with the truth. which is going to be properly researched and evidence-based and factual. And we've already tried this actually, and very successfully, I think, with this Churchill conference that you mentioned earlier, because Policy Exchange, the think tank, put out I think it's like a 20-page refutation of the arguments made that I wrote along with Zuditu Gebrionis, and together this has been put onto the History Reclaimed website, so anyone can read it, and it's had a tremendous response actually.
Yes, also I'm reminded of the Free Speech Union. It's a similar sort of thing where basically people can go and sort of actually have advice as what they can.
That's right. Well, with what Toby Young is doing in the Free Speech Union is a kind of more general kind of thing that History Reclaimed is doing, but it actually gives you proper legal advice. If you think that you've been sacked for some woke, politically correct reason, if you're a Brexiteer, for example, and you've been chucked out of your job because of that, then you go to Toby and the Free Speech Union, which I'm also very proud to be involved in, and they will lawyer up for you.
So this is a fight back, really, isn't it? I mean, with History Reclaimed.
A very late one. We're tiptoeing around what can be and can't be done. But yes, of course it's a fight back, because you're actually fighting for something that's really worthwhile. I mean, British history is not something to be ashamed of. It's something to be proud of. And it's tragic that isn't taken for granted, really, by lots of people.
Well, I think history, surely, basically you shouldn't wipe out people's background, their memory, their story,
and their ancestors. If you have a grandfather who worked in the the Ceylonese police force, then you should be proud of that, because these people, 99 times out of 100, were doing excellent and good work, and for them to be sort of attacked and slagged off just because they were colonialists or imperialists or so on, I think is a terrible way to treat people's ancestors.
Well, what we should do, we'll put the link to History Reclaimed. You'll see it under this video, and do go and look at it. It's fantastic stuff. And Andrew, thank you very much for that. And the book, again, George III, by Andrew Roberts, The Life and Reign of Britain's Most Misunderstood Monarch. It is majestic. Thank you very, very much.
You are kind, Peter. I've much enjoyed it.
Thank you. That's it for So What You're Saying Is. We shall be back next time. Thank you very much.